Hello, happy New Year. Thank you very much for being here today. It's such a pleasure. Feels like there's just so many thank yous that I'll say them in that order. Thank you very much, Bénédicte, for the opportunity to curate this. But thank you all for holding this famous being here with us today. We're calling this Dislocation Tuesdays, renaming the brainchild of the art history department, which was originally called Translocation Tuesdays. This is our second series, or our second event of this series. The first one was about the colonial archives, and today we're continuing with Cosmopolitanism, Positionality, and shared heritage. We have two more coming up. There's one on womanhood, and there's another one coming up on colonial dislocation and love. We're looking forward to having more engagements like this with you, and without holding too much of your time, I'll introduce Dr. Sol Izquierdo de la Viña, who is our moderator today. So I'll do this from the paper because I know Sol Izquierdo de la Viña as a person, but today she's wearing a professional hat. So Sol Izquierdo de la Viña is a Margarita Salas postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Art Studies at the Technische Universität, where she is conducting the research project Traveling Identity, Orientalist Imaginaries of Lene Schneider Keine, through her journeys during the Weimar Republic and in exile. Previously, she was a pre-doctoral fellow in the Department of Art History of the Complutense University in Madrid. Her PhD examined the reception of Indian art and culture in the world of Izquierdo from transcultural and post-colonial perspectives. Recently, she has been the co-curator of the exhibition Whose Expression? The Brücke Artist and Colonialism at the Brücke Museum in Berlin. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so good evening and welcome everyone. Yeah, yeah. First of all, I would like to thank the two curators of this Dislocation series, Jeanne-Ange and Fogha MC, RFM, for inviting me to moderate this panel discussion today. I'm very pleased to moderate the second of this KuK-Tuesdays series. So for those which are here today for the first time, this events series aim to provide a space of exchange between the research of our institute and perspectives from other practitioners, artists, and activists. And the session today will highlight the terms cosmopolitanism, positionality, and shared heritage and their use within the restitution debate. We will start with an input presentation by Fogha MC RFM, who is going to introduce some theoretical thoughts, I think, about today's topic. And afterwards, Dr. Ohiniko Toffa and Dr. Njabulo Chipangura will give us an insight into their practices at different museums. After these three presentations, I will ask them some questions, and we will afterwards open the panel to the audience. I'd like to start by introducing both curators. Jeanne-Ange Wagne. She's a Cameroonian diasporic art historian and a creative whose theoretical research and practice of the art educations are oriented towards necessary questions of social justice, solidarity, and self-determination. Currently, she is critically examining Western historiography, addressing colonial entanglements, and that affect cultural and educational institutions. She works as a student assistant at the Institute for Art Studies at TU Berlin in the DFG-funded project The Restitution of Knowledge, led in partnership with the University of Oxford and the Pitt Rivers Museum. And the second of our curators, Fogha MC Cornelius Rifem, aka Wan Wo Lair. No? I'm not. Yeah. It's a self-prescribed severe drapetomania patient. Since last year, he is PhD candidate at the Potsdam University Research Training Group Minor Cosmopolitanism program. And yeah, Fogha is gonna give the first input presentation, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. There's a lot going on. Usually I'm a little erratic when I talk, and I'm not used to being in front of the audience. I like to be in the audience and then cause disruption. Now I am meant to create an order, give a sort of structure to this conversation. Given that I'm a drapetomania patient and that I am used to causing disruption, I wish or I hope that I can cause that disruption here in an orderly fashion. So today we're going to be discussing, really the question we're discussing today is whose world? Whose world are we talking about and whose world are we living in when we refer to cosmopolitanism and when we refer to shared heritage or positionality? And why have we chosen these terms that have no string whatsoever to be the title of a conversation? I'll try to read what I wrote. I'll not stay in line, I think. At its most basic form, cosmopolitanism is the idea that all human beings are, should be, or could be part of one human community. This idea of the cosmopolitan, of being part of one human community, has been used to justify ethnological museums looting, dispossession, and dislocation of art objects. In fact, it is a morally justified mission. Because if you were to move art objects from any part of the world, wherever you moved them, for whomever they were made, and for whatever reason they were made, it is justified because we are all part of one human society. And that work that you do would be the appreciation of aesthetic contributions to the human experience. This idea has driven the creation of not just infrastructure in the sense of museums, but the creation of theories, of concepts, and of justifications for why looting should happen, why it should be preserved, why it should be justified, and at all cost, why it should be a defended space of being. The elephant in the room when we speak about these things, there are two of those elephants. One of them is a conceptual one, restitution. The second one is a more structural one. I think of that one as a distraction, and it's the Humboldt Forum. As it has been the tradition in Berlin in recent years and in most of Western Europe to shoot at the Humboldt Forum when we have these conversations around culture and shared heritage, I would continue in that light. Not necessarily to frame the Humboldt Forum as the institution or the responsible for this dissonance that we witness with cosmopolitanism and its use, but rather as a way of grounding the experience and the conversation that we will be having here today. I went to the Humboldt Forum at the invitation of a friend recently for a performance that was called Viña. And it's only when I got inside the Humboldt Forum that I found there were two invitations. And these were two invitations other than the one my friend had issued for me to come. The first of those two invitations is to be an object. As a person of color, when I go inside that museum, inside those spaces, and it could be in any other museum, I become an object. My life, as it were, becomes a performance of how Western societies have become progressive and how these spaces have become inclusive. Spaces where black men like me would not be able to access, spaces where a few decades ago we would have the back seat. Now people look at me and go, ah yeah, we have come far. It's sort of performance of Dr. King's mundane, sort of the banal remaking of his dream. The second invitation is to be an objectifier. That is what we're discussing here today. And what I hate about the Humboldt Forum is not it as a place. It's what I become when I go into that space. That I lend my eyes, my body, my voice, and my presence to the objectification of other people, where pain, dispossession, dislocation, anger, and all other emotions are performed for my sole pleasure. So much so that Viña, a performance about the impact of colonization on Tanzania and on Tanzanian culture and on the dislocation of that culture, the continuous justification of that dislocation, epistemic violence and physical violence, that I sit there and I tell myself, this is an awesome performance. And today what we're talking about is exactly this. That when in December, Herman Patzinger declares that after the restitution or the return of the Benin bronzes, that the return is not the central part of it, that the return allows for the promotions of museums here, in Germany, and there. But he says a second thing in an interview that he had with Welt, where he says, it is also good that we give back these things, and 10 of 514 objects were returned, and that the rest of them be displayed here, so that the rest of the world can see it. Or he said they would be displayed so that they can have access worldwide. And what does worldwide mean if these things don't even have access Berlin-wide? So whose world are we talking about here? It's exactly that question that I am asking. When you say worldwide and you refer to a specific structure, the Humboldt Forum, you're not only making a European world by dispossessing those other worlds, you're simultaneously rejecting the existence of other worlds. And so today, maybe we're not refusing cosmopolitanism. That is not what I want to do. It will be too easy to completely reject it. Perhaps what we should do is rethink it, to ask Europe, what do you mean by cosmopolitanism, and what does cosmopolitanism mean for me? And not to reject the idea simply because it's European. Well, ideas have no borders. So maybe cosmopolitanism in this case could be that by engaging in restitution or emplacement of cultures that have been displaced, that what we're doing is rethinking the world, even from an individual perspective, or relating to institutions, to systems, and to processes that have had worldwide and world-making consequences. That by simply as a person questioning, why is my culture displayed at the Humboldt Forum? That I am engaging in a cosmopolitan act. That cosmopolitanism is not an automatic belonging to the world, but one that someone has to think of one's relation to the world, one's position in the world, and one's relationship with that world and what that world means, both internally and externally. But extending that idea to mean, if we thought of cosmopolitanism as relations, as a liminal space, as movement, must we necessarily think of it in categories of inside and outside? Can we go beyond those borders? If we provincialize Europe, does it mean we universalize Africa? And what we're doing here today really is to discuss this cosmopolitanism, the state of our world, the state of the museum in it, and using the museum as a grounding to discuss colonial infrastructure beyond and outside the museum, our existence outside of those museums, the possibility of existence outside of the museum, but not just outside of the museum, because that centers the museum still. So perhaps I would not say how to decolonize the museum in Africa. Can we integrate it into our culture? And if we agree that the museum is colonized in Europe, why do we build museums in Africa then? Or why do we want to promote museums in Africa? When the same Herman Patzinger would say, yes, the museum in Europe is colonized, we have to rethink it. So you build a colonial structure or a structure that you have explicitly agreed is colonized in another place. And why I say we do not universalize Africa is to point out the fact that we can't talk about cosmopolitanism, belonging in the world, being in the world, without thinking from a specific position. And if you can look beyond the borders of our skin tones today, 3 black men sitting here talking about cosmopolitanism, what a diverse world we are. If you can look beyond the border of race and of gender, that we understand that diversity is not just about the performance or involvement of people from minority or from minoritized positions, but that it also involves rethinking how we produce and perform and reproduce knowledge, then I would invite you to engage in this conversation, not just as passive listeners, not just as active listeners, but to ask questions to our panelists and to yourselves. Whose cosmopolitanism, whose world, and from where am I speaking? Both physically, theoretically, and if you believe in higher powers, spiritually. And if we can't get to a specific answer, let us at least get some mental stimulation on the way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Fogha, for this rethinking of the use, reuse, abuse of these terms. So cosmopolitanism, shared heritage. I think it was a great input, and I think we will have much to discuss. So please draft your questions for afterwards. But before we will have 2 more presentations. Now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Ohiniko Toffa. Dr. Ohiniko Toffa is a scholar of mission and colonial history. He currently works as a research associate at the GRASSI Museum of Ethnology in Leipzig, where he's conducting a project on the provenance research of the collections from Togo. This project, founded by the Deutsches Zentrum für Kulturgutverluste, deals with around 700 objects from the state ethnographic collections of Saxony, acquired through activities of German scholars, traders, colonial officials, and missionaries in Togo during the German colonial rule. Previously, he studied German and cultural studies at the University of Lomé in Togo and finished his PhD at the University of Bremen with the scholarship. His PhD research with the title Christliche Moral und koloniale Herrschaft in Togo, die Missionskonzeption Franz Michaels Zahns 1862-1900, will be published this year by Transcript Verlag. So we are looking forward to that. And we are also looking forward to your talk. So please.
Thank you. Thank you. Is that okay? Thank you for the invitation, Jeanne-Ange and Fogha. Achille Mbembe said the real scientific work starts when you find the right word to express your idea. And that was my dilemma when I was proceeding and preparing my presentation. The right word to express my idea was difficult to be found. And And there, the title I put there, I want to provoke a situation which I called the colonial situation. Reading it, can you understand what I'm saying? That was the same situation in the colonial time. Colonized people are saying something, though other people are trying to translate them, and white colonizers are understanding other things. We call it the colonial misunderstanding. And my project is to show this colonial misunderstanding in a way of epistemological rupture between the metropole and the colony. That's why I choose the three words, nu sensen wo, subo subo wo, konyinyi wo. There are three words of the Ewe language where I come from. I will try to introduce and present my hypothesis and show an example from a collection I am working on at the GRASSI Museum, especially the collection of KuK-Tuesdays. And I will show a legba, an icon of the people, the Ewe people, where the collection came from. And finally, I will problematize and pronounce my thesis. The word religion doesn't exist in the Ewe language. But when you come to Europe and you visit museum, you will be seeing everywhere the Ewe religion, the Togolese religion, and something like that. And this is not my personal finding. It is from a missionary, German missionary, who went there, researched everywhere the word religion, and he didn't find it. And he is saying, with regard to religion, the first thing to note is that the Ewe have no word for it. They have susuo, or ideas, thoughts about the divine, and they also have expression for the activity of their relationship to the divine. But the language does not have an expression corresponding to the concept of religion. So what he is calling susuo or idea is very bad translated, but I accept it like that. And so only this definition pose problem for me. What's now fetishism? When you go to museum, they label everything fetishism. And what's now paganism? They are all wrong words for the spiritual conception of the colonized people at that time. Question now, how could people who hardly believe in religions, who hardly believe in God, I mean the colonizers, or who can only imagine one God, understand such a complex world? That's my question. So that's why I'm criticizing the colonial reason, this kind of pure reason, and the colonial subjectivity and the colonial ethics. While walking, I'm lost in translation, and I want to put you through the feeling to be lost in translation. And I try to translate subo subo, and there is no word for it, but I try to put it with worshipping. And no sense will be things to be respected. And konyinyi can be translated with written traditions. Lost in translation, difficult to be put in the European words. But KuK-Tuesdays, this is a collection of KuK-Tuesdays, a biography of KuK-Tuesdays. The KuK-Tuesdays collection can be categorized in three. We have the Legbao. I don't have a word for that. Acclamao, I don't have a word for that in German and neither in English. And Jokao. Biography of Goethe. Goethe was born in Rostock and died in Dresden. He was a businessman, trader, and director of the cigarette factory Yasmati AG in Dresden. He never traveled to the former colony of Togo. He acquired the collection for the Völkerkunde Museum in Dresden. In return, an order of Rita Erste Klasse, Knight First Class was delivered to him to award, to thank him for the collection. So he paid for that 190 objects and paid 5,000 Deutsche Mark to acquire it and give it to the museum. And the King of Saxony gave Goethe recognition for that, for doing that thing. And this is a letter addressed to Goethe, where they state they accept to give him the recognition. It was awarded to him on the 20th October. And to the General Director Yasmati, Miss Ernst Friedrich Goethe, in recognition of your service to the Royal Zoological and Anthropological Ethnographic Museum in Dresden, His Majesty the King has the most general authority to award you the Knight Cross First Class of the Order of Albrecht. That was the business. And among the collection of Goethe, I found this one. And I brought a picture of it to you, to show you. And that's what is presented here and to be called as fetish. And that's how the museum presented fetish. And what inspired me is they put the away name under, and they wrote there, Agbo Hanya Va. Maybe they don't understand how they are writing themselves. If they really understand how they are writing, they should not call it fetish. And they call it also ceramic figure. So I don't know what it means with ceramic figure. But for me, it is what we call legba. Legbao, the plural is legbao. Slightly wrong, Agbohanya translated as Torhüter, gatekeeper, is not the real meaning of what is written there. It is a very, very secret language, and it's difficult for me to translate it now because I don't know really the deep understanding, the deep meaning of what is written. Maybe someone who is engaged in this situation can translate it more than me. But the word Agbo can have two meanings in the way. Agbo, like the door, but Agbo, like Vida. Vida, this animal. 50 years. Mm-hmm. It can have also this meaning. So according to the meaning, we can understand what this means, what they are saying. And I researched on the word legba. I researched first of all in the mission ethnography, and try to understand how they understand them. And I find it slightly an attempt to understand legba in the missionary ethnography, and an article of a missionary piece who is saying the Ewe indicate the human life figure made of clay, which can be found on paths and public space and in front of the entrance to a village, even near the huts by the name Legbao. Now that sacrifices are made to the Legba spirit, whereby prayers are performed, the fetishistic is abandoned. For according to the words of nature, of natives, sacrifices are not made to fetish. So Spies is really said what he is saying. The word fetish is not suitable to express the reality of what is put there. Legba is not an heavy word, but comes from Dahomey, and there it means procreation. So comment on the missionaries and museum explanation of the colonized Ewe conception of life. Fetish is highly reductionist and culturally degrading. No proper understanding of the Ewe language. They lies a lot. They adapted. And there is also a banalization of the spirituality of the colonized people. I can see a degradation and profanation. And with Spies, I can say there is a mauvaise foi, and based on Jean-Paul Sartre philosophy. I don't know how I get mauvaise foi. Mauvaise foi is for someone who try to cover himself under lies to accept a situation, even if he understands really things, he want to change it, because Spies was in a colonial possession. Even he knows what he is, that it's not like that, but he didn't changes because he is in a dispositive to defend a superiority of white people. That's what I realize. And I want to put also, and I don't have a figure for that, Sakpate is also a spirituality in Togo, and for Sakpate I don't have a translation, a word for that. Sakpate is for Mother Earth. And Mother, because the Ewe consider the earth as nourishing everybody. And because everybody is using the earth to work, therefore Sakpate is an ethic to protect, to take care, and to respect the earth. It is here, like when I want to translate it, to put it in European knowledge system, I can say it is something like Francis Bacon philosophy, like you will condemn to the nature, you will commend to the nature by respecting the nature. That's something like that. And Sakpate said, you shall not wish evil to your fellow man. Whoever wishes bad evil to his fellow violates the rule of general protection. However, this does not mean that one cannot defend oneself. Sakpate actually calls for a minimal goodness among people. That's the philosophy of Sakpate. And the people who use Sakpate don't cut trees anyhow. They don't urinate on the street. It is not allowed to urinate. And when they see you urinating, and I can remember my father, when you stop to urinate on street, you will get a slap. So don't do that. So all those things are disappearing now in the society because we want more progress. So I want to finish now with my thesis. A cosmopolitan should prevent collecting in colonial context. I showed now the rupture between Europe, the colonial metropoles, and colonies. And that's why I come to the conclusion a cosmopolitan, when he or she exists in the colonial time, will fight against the collection for two reasons. Respect for culture and cultural treasures, where you can find them and where you can admire them, is at the head of cosmopolitanism. The work can be admired in and through a singular object. If transport or displacement puts in danger the importance of cultural treasures, the cosmopolitan will renounce it. If one likes a flower, it may not be the best idea to pick it and own it, but to protect it where it was found and water it. It's right there. Cosmopolitanism renounces possessions precisely in the name of its desire to be a citizen of the world. This means the cosmopolitanism implicitly and perhaps very explicitly requires of us to develop a theory of restitution that may be based on the following point. Space and value. Space where the objects are, they have a certain value there. When we displace them, it may lose their value and added value. We need to reset on the added value. And so, subjectivity and morality. Those who cannot prove respect to these cultural goods should not touch them, especially racists and extremists. I don't know like them. Renunciation of possessions, recognition of cultural belonging and diversity, deconstructing privileges. And when I am talking about privileges, I want to give an example. I wanted to work on a collection in a museum in Germany. I was kicked out. 1 or 2 years later, they gave it to another one. And that's not good. That's why I said we need to deconstruct our privileges. Criticism of colonial thinking and criticizing also racism. Protection of cultural assets everywhere they are as a duty of all world citizens. They will be happy to travel to Africa, for instance, to admire the object there. No reaffirmation of the colonial centers. I mean, they are the colonial metropoles. They don't need to be empowered too much, but also now in the sense of transnational justice, support for the so-called periphery in that time. I'll stop there if there is question.
Thank you, Ohiniko. I guess some of your thoughts will connect with the next presentation, as I see also some connections with the previous one. I'd like to introduce our last panelist, Dr. Njabulo Chipangura. He holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. And he is currently the curator of living cultures at the Manchester Museum at the University of Manchester. As a curator of living cultures, he is responsible for the care of more than 20,000 objects from Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas, as well as building new research and forming relationships and collaborations. He was previously a curator for the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe in the archaeology department for 10 years. And Dr. Chipangura has extensively published on the ongoing debates around the coloniality of museums and all associated knowledge production and representation practices to imagine a decolonized museum in Africa. His first book, entitled Museums as Agents for Social Change, Collaborative Programs at the Mutare Museum, was published by Routledge in April 2021. So, please, we are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation, and I'm going to sort of like share with you my thoughts on decolonizing the museum in practical or praxis perspectives, and I'm going to speak about work that I'm currently doing at the University of Manchester as a curator of living cultures, as she said. I'm responsible for a large collection of ethnographic objects that were dispossessed or literally stolen from different parts of the world by the British Empire as they were expanding and colonizing both people and objects. So I'm currently doing a provenance research, a collaborative research with some colleagues in South Africa on a collection of very impressive traditional Zulu beads that are at Manchester Museum. So my talk is going to be on provenance research, not only as a function of restitution, but as an idea of trying to think about how we can collaborate with indigenous communities in rewriting and retelling the stories of objects that were looted and stolen from their original context. So I'll start off by briefly showing how museum collections in Europe at Manchester was a function of ordering things. So the history of collecting African objects as things is closely linked to colonial expansion and colonial violence. The object that we have at Manchester Museum from Africa, they came through as a result of colonial violence, which came with the expansion of the British Empire. So cultural objects and human remains were looted, appropriated, and dispossessed from source communities during the colonial period. So in pursuit of ordering colonial materials, material culture was taken away from colonized societies and deprived of its original meaning and context, and scrutinized through the lenses of knowledge production. Colonial knowledge production can either be anthropological knowledge production, archaeological knowledge production, ignoring the biography of these objects. And I'm going to use the word objects in a very careful kind of manner, because as I'll speak through the presentation, these things are not just objects as they are perceived in a museum, but they're living cultures or ancestors of living people in Africa from where they were stolen or looted away from. So the disciplines of knowledge production in museums prioritize what I call the ethnographic gaze. So this gazing is a result of thinking about materialities as representing aesthetic value. Objects were collected not because they had meanings, but they were collected because they thought of them as beautiful and representing unique designs or unique representation of people's cultures. So these objects were imprisoned in museum storage rooms with no meaning or no context. They are seen as lifeless, static, and frozen in some kind of timeless past, waiting to be explored by researchers. So cultural representations are done in museums, thinking about materialities as functions of disciplines and orders of archaeology, ethnography, or anthropology. So coming to Manchester Museum, where I'm working as a curator of living cultures, it's a very interesting title actually, or position. So let me just give you what I think is a decolonial position, for lack of a better word. So this used to be a curator of anthropology, but because we recognize that this collection is representing living people, living cultures, so they changed the position with my appointment to curator of living cultures. I was appointed last year around April, May. So the idea really is to reconfigure our thinking around materialities, not as things, but representing living cultures of living people from where they were stolen away from or looted. So I think in the conversation of cosmopolitism and shared authority, shared heritage, I think this is just an acknowledgement that what we're keeping at Manchester Museum are not just materialities, but they're just living culture, living beings connecting to living people that are still living in Africa from where the things were taken away from. So the Manchester Museum is part of the University of Manchester. It's a university museum, fortunately, because it allows us to really think critically on what we have, what we hold, with a bit of academic freedom in our programs and our research agendas of restituting and repatriating unethically collected cultural materials. It's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, university museum in the UK, with close to 4.5 million objects and specimens. We have anthropological collections, archaeological collections, botanical collections, geological collections, and entomological collections. Currently, we are closed. We're undergoing a major capital project called Hello Future. We're opening in February with exciting new exhibitions, co-produced, co-curated by a collective of diaspora community members from South Asia, from China. Apparently, there's a new China culture gallery coming up. Then there's a South Asia gallery coming up. But we haven't thought about an African gallery, which I'm going to explain why later. So my anthropological collection or ethnological collection, or rather the living culture collection, as it is now called, comprises of 25,000 ethnographic objects categorized in accordance to the following geographic regions. It's more like an encyclopedic museum with everything from everywhere. From Africa, Americas, to Oceania, and Asia. So the curator of living cultures, as I said, I think it's a starting point to think about how titles can be decolonized. I think there's a museum in the UK, I think the Ontarian, they have a new curator of discomfort, which I find very interesting. Yeah, curator of discomfort in colonialism and colonial histories of museums. And we also have a curator of indigenous perspectives at Manchester Museum, which again is a new position that was created last year to try and position ourselves within these ongoing debates around decolonizing our collections and what it means to decolonize in a praxis point of view. So I suspect curator of living cultures is more like a decolonial working practice. Why? We are acknowledging that the collection that I'm responsible for is not a function of materialities or the material fabric of things, but rather it's representing living people, living cultures from where the collections were looted, dispossessed, or dislocated from. So these objects, in an African context, I mean, objects are not objects because they look beautiful, but they are used for specific ritual and ceremonial functions. So they are ancestors of living people. So the word object has to be problematized as well. What are we calling objects? Are these representation of anthropological knowledge production? They're not objects as per se. They're living cultures of living people. They're ancestors of living people, which is a good starting point to talk about when we think about how to decolonize collections and the spaces that we work in with collections. So the biographical story from an African context is very, very important to think about. In Africa, objects have potency, and they are treated by indigenous communities as living beings, which they can touch, smell, and taste, which you don't find in a museum, unfortunately, because of conservation tropes. You can't touch, you can't do anything. Supposed to keep. Although these objects might appear stagnant in museum classifications, they've got individual biographies and carry with them important meanings connected to their ritual and cultural functions located in the areas of origin. So just a reiteration of what I said earlier on, the African collection at Manchester Museum has got more than 7,000 cultural objects that came from different parts of the African continent, mostly or all of them former British colonies. Half of these objects are unprovenanced. They are categorized as African objects, which I find very troubling because we tend to reduce Africa as just this country, right? They came from Africa, but what is Africa in Africa? Africa is a very big, vast geographical space with east, west, southern, and northern. So we have this unprovenance collection at Manchester Museum that are only labeled Africa. So some of them are very sacred and ceremonial, and they're classified according to Western ways of knowing and doing that ultimately have ignored or erased indigenous ways and knowledge systems. So how then does a decolonial praxis look like at Manchester Museum, considering all these histories of collection that I've spoken about? And what are some of the methodologies that we are using at Manchester Museum, which constitute what I call a praxis or practical action of decolonizing the museum. Because in most cases, we're really talking about decolonization as an epistemological term, like it's more like epistemological thinking of decolonization. But what does the praxis of decolonial work look like in collections and in exhibitions? I start off by providing a context or theorizing how decolonizing the collection in a museum might look like. So it entails just decoding the museum collection from their colonial meanings, in which they were cut off, displayed, and decontextualized from where they once belonged, and then labeled in a museum and categorized according to Western ways of viewing and knowledge, and serving the function of colonialism and imperialism. So how do we think about these objects as not just as objects, but as living cultures and living beings from where they were made and from where they were collected from? I also think of how to make the museum so disobedient, like rupturing the old ways and the old ways of collecting and categorizing knowledge. So the disobedient museum for me is a thinking around how we can prioritize those communities who were formerly marginalized from the museum as a function of institutionalized or disciplined knowledge production system. So the disobedient museum will become a very good methodology which we can embrace and use by involving and collaborating voices from local communities to reorder objects at Manchester Museum in a non-disciplinary way. Essentially, the disobedient museum is both a concept and a methodology which rethinks the ways in which museums can engage with both local diaspora community members and source community members in doing exhibitions and collections reconfiguration. So here are some of the examples of decolonial perspectives and practice at Manchester Museum. I've been involved in a comprehensive research project, provenance research, on Zulu traditional beads with colleagues in South Africa, working collaboratively, and communities in South Africa as well, as a way of trying to rethink the category of materiality and bringing together the voices of people or communities that are still making beads in South Africa. So there's also what we call indigenous curatorship, which I'm going to explain on how we did it in the Zulu traditional beads exhibition. And then the idea of co-production, co-curatorship. Curatorship has for long been a domain of expertism. But how do we collaborate and make sure that communities are also curating their own stories from their own vantage points without having a curator as the holder of all systems of knowledge? So curators can also facilitate dialogues and allow communities to proactively exhibit their stories. I'll look at the downside of decolonial methodology of museums and what it means in terms of power geographies. How, in most cases, we think about collaborating, but we're not even collaborating. We're recreating the same kind of colonial tropes and sanitizing collaborations by not collaborating in actual terms with communities. So this is an illustration of the very impressive beads. I think there are about 3,000 of these pieces at Manchester Museum. They were collected around the 1930s. They're just labeled Zulu traditional beads or beadwork from South Africa. That's it. So I'm collaborating with colleagues in South Africa at a museum called Dislocation Cultural Museum in Pretoria to think about giving these beads an absent meaning, which is derived from their points of origins. And in South Africa, in KwaNongoma, where we went for the research, they're still making beads like this. And they're telling real stories of what these beads are made for in terms of color representation, cultural significance, ritual significance, which you don't find in a museum. In a museum at Manchester, these are just beads, these are just objects that are reduced for their material value and their aesthetic value. So in view of looking at the absent stories, we did a research on these beads in South Africa, trying to look at where exactly in South Africa did these beads come from, how were they collected, when were they collected, and what are the underlying uses of these beads in contemporary societies in terms of rituals, in terms of ceremonies, and what are some of the contemporary cultural practices that the beads are still being used for today. So our curatorial intervention came from the sense of rethinking curatorship, not as just as a domain of expertise, but as a relational practice of care of objects through active relations of reciprocity and dialogue with communities from where these beads were looted and stolen from. So these are some of the visual representation. And what I find very interesting as well is this kind of, the labels, you have the labels, and prominently you see, what you see there are the names of the collectors, you know. The people who collected are always there. That's so dominant in all of these objects. You see people who collected are always there. But there's no story whatsoever why these beads were collected and what they meant from where they were collected from, which is the biographical story that we need to do and to re-look at when we do provenance research. So this part, or these pictures are similar beads that the Disong Museum in South Africa also collect. And the South Africa example is very interesting because museums in Africa are also, in many ways, they are still suffering from colonial fatigue. They still have a colonial history, which also needs to be decolonized in a way. So we're speaking about decoloniality of museums in Europe, but museums in Africa, they were also formed as a result of colonial encounters, right? So they still have the same similar problem of colonial histories and inappropriately displayed objects that needs to be decolonized, much as the same way that we're doing in the UK. So these beads are from the South African collaboration. The colleague of mine who I'm working with also has got a beads that are similar to what we have at Manchester Museum. So what do we mean by collaborations, and how can we ensure that collaborations become methodologies of decolonizing the museum? Collaborations ensures that communities are not considered as passive audiences of authoritative forms of knowledge production, but are implicated in ongoing process of knowledge production and debates as co-producers of knowledge. So we did carry out an ethnographic research in KwaZulu-Natal in June last year to follow up on the visual analogy of the beads that we have at Manchester. We showed the communities the beads in visual representation, and the communities were allowed to sort of like tell us the stories of how these beads are being made up today and how they're being used as living cultures and not as objects in a museum storage. So that was part of the exercise, the engagement with the communities, and they're still making similar beads that we find in the museum. So it's very, very important to engage with communities in this sense, because the beads are a representation of living cultures, and they are making them and they're using them in different ritual, ceremonial, and other secular function, as we saw from the collaborative research in KwaZulu-Natal. So in terms of thinking about another methodology of decolonizing the museum, co-curatorship can also be viewed as a way in which you can co-curate new stories, new narratives with source communities, and then you allow them to tell the story of the objects in an exhibition. So we did this as well during the research, and we're coming up with a new exhibition at Manchester Museum that is going to be reflective of the stories of the community in KwaZulu-Natal, which is different from the ways in which the museum used to be exclusively a container of objects from the colonized with no story whatsoever. So now the co-curatorship allows people to have a voice on their objects and how they want to be displayed in the museum at Manchester. So I also play around ideas of indigenous curatorship. What does it mean for indigenous communities to curate their objects? And I'm mindful of the fact that some of these objects, before they were dislocated, they were used for particular reasons, and they were curated by these communities, not in museum spaces, but their own ways of curating. So what are these indigenous curatorship methodologies that ensure the survival of these material objects before they found their way in museums in Europe? So the idea of a museum might be Eurocentric in a sense, but African communities had their own ways of museumizing and keeping their objects, which made them survive before they were dislocated and placed in museums in Europe. So the result of the research is a new exhibition at Manchester Museum, which is going to tell co-produced stories that were obtained from the provenance research in KwaZulu-Natal last year in June. So the same at Dislocation Cultural Museum, South Africa, the stories of the beads are going to be incorporated into the narratives at the museum, and this will allow the intangible values and the intangible conversations of the beads to be incorporated and to be used in the new kind of handling and reorganization of the anthropological collection at Dislocation Cultural Museum in South Africa. So now my last point is on this critical aspect of collaborations and what it means to collaborate in terms of power geographies. Collaborations have now been used as a shorthand of decolonizing the museum. And in as much as we think we're collaborating as curators and collaborating with communities, but again, there's still an equal distribution of power in terms of communities taking the leading role in formulating the projects. So in as much as we think of collaborations a very nice decolonial methodology, curators will ultimately end up retaining much of the power and decide on how they want the stories to be told in a museum. So ideally, yes, it's a methodology of decolonizing the museum, but it's not the best, or it's not the end of it, because power geographies are still inherent in collaborative practices in museums. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation and your thoughts. I would like to move on to the questions. We have prepared together with Fogha and Jeanne 2 questions for each of you and like a general final question. I would like to start with Ohiniko. In an interview about your work at the GRASSI Museum of Ethnology in Leipzig, you said that, in your opinion, and I quote, "The museum of the future is indispensably a post-colonial museum." So what is the difference between this post-colonial museum and the decolonial museum, and which are the specific premises of such a museum?
Thank you. Difficult to be answered, but I will try. I think post-colonial theories are the base of decolonial thought. So when I am saying post-colonial museum, it is a museum conception based on post-colonial theories. And decolonizing is basically epistemic, decolonizing the knowledge. But post-colonial is also political. And that's why I gathered all of them in post-colonial matters. I hope I have answered. I will stop there because it's difficult because what I'm seeing now in the museum is a little bit, they are far away of what we want as change. And I don't expect that it will be soon. So I want to continue to fight, to reflect, and to jump in. And so that's why I put it like a big agenda, post-colonial museum, because many things are involved in it. Not only in Europe, in the so-called centers, but also in the so-called periphery, like Africa and the old colonies. When we are talking about restitution and African cultures, we are happy. We are fighting against supremacy. We are fighting against privilege. But when it comes to talk about gender question, for instance, and changing us mentality in Africa, it stopped there. We need also to engage such questions. Restitution should take also all those questions because it is, for me, an agenda of progressive thought. It is a way to fight neo-colonial perspectives and to work for a new emerging society. If not, we are not moving forward. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So, a process still in progress, and yeah, we hope everyone is engaging. Our second question. I will start. So many ethnological collections, including those of the State's collection of Saxony, so where you are working now, are made by erasure, erroneous object designations, and man-made voids. Against this background, to what extent does the use of the term shared heritage in the context of such ethnological collections still seem appropriate or even meaningful?
I'm not happy with the word shared heritage. I mean, in which on how it is shared. Colonialism was violence, totally brutality against people. What is shared there? What is? I don't know. Who is sharing now this heritage? And in which way are we sharing it? They gather them in the museum there. They are making money out of them. And what is the? I don't like this strategy to put decolonizing on projects to have money and stop it there. Or to say, we are decolonizing museum, and that's why decolonize is now en vogue, and so I will do also decolonizing. It is shared heritage. We are sharing now. I don't know. The same thing for the world. The world. World cultural heritage. It is the colonized people, colonizers. They went to Africa, to Asia, to Oceania, to conquer the world. In which way are we talking now about world? For which word are we working? Fogha or stay? I like that because that's thoughts I'm dealing with, because we cannot continue like that with the same legitimating colonial legitimations rhetoric. We need to change the rhetorics, and before it will be shared, let us engage a deep critical reflection on the narratives of things, allow people to get access to reflect on it, and the museum should be stop talking now, and they will listen to what we all have to say and to learn from that. A big support to Bénédicte for your work, because it is a big thing, a big deal.
So now my two questions, or our two questions to Dr. Njabulo Chipangura. You have been mainly in your presentation talking about your work during the last year, or since April you mentioned, at the Manchester Museum, but we will also like to know more about your previous experience as a curator in Zimbabwe. So my question is there a difference or any difference in the way the colonial rethinking of museum collections has to proceed or had to proceed in the Mutare Museum in Zimbabwe compared to the Manchester Museum?
Thank you. I think I'll start off by saying museums in Africa, they were created at a particular moment of history, colonization. Right? So essentially, museums in Africa are byproducts of colonization. They were formed during the colonial period, right? So the collection practices of that particular moment was also based on colonial violence, right? Amongst the local people So the Mutare Museum, where I used to work as an archaeologist for 10 years, it was opened in 1964, and Zimbabwe is a former British colony called Rhodesia. It was named after Sir John Rhodes, as perhaps part of his personal collection of countries. So it's called Rhodesia. So that museum was formed in 1964. Essentially, it was formed as a result of colonization, and we have all these disciplines of colonial ordering within the museum. I was curator of archaeology. Archaeology is quite problematic as a colonial discipline, right? I was speaking to Bénédicte earlier about how, when I spoke to my parents that I wanted to study archaeology at university, they said to me, "What? You want to be a grave robber?" Yeah, that's how people in Africa still view certain practices, certain disciplines. And the museum in Africa, up to now, people still view it with a bit of fear and skepticism. Why? During colonization, these museums were no spaces for the local people, right? They were formed as these elitist spaces for white people. Local people were just exhibited through their cultures, right? This is how this group of people look like in this location. So your question about Manchester Museum and Mutare Museum, I think, yes, there is a difference, right? But it's not so different because these two museums, Manchester Museum is in the UK, right? Mutare Museum is in Zimbabwe in Africa, but it was formed during colonization. Zimbabwe is a former British colony, and we still have same kind of collection practices, right? Colonized material culture from local people, right? Local people were marginalized from museum practices. They were only studied as the other. So I think essentially museums in Africa need to be decolonized as well from a local ontological perspective, right? We run away from this fact thinking that repatriating objects back to Africa would do good to African communities. Yes, it will. But in most cases, we're going to repatriate to another colonial museum in Africa. You're just recreating the colonial process in a new space. So what do we do in an African context? Let's start by doing the decolonial work within the local grassroots level and make people understand that museums can be spaces for dialogue about their cultures, and they can participate in reinterpretation of their material culture in a post-colonial, decolonial moment.
Yep, thank you. In your talk, you have shared with us your position or also your work regarding provenance research. But we would like to know more precisely what is, in your opinion, the role of restitution in this decolonizing process.
I think decolonization in museums has become more of a metaphor, like a buzzword, where everyone has to tag along decolonization to look politically correct, right? But my approach is not so much about the buzzword, the metaphor, the epistemology. I think what lacks in most museums is the praxis, like the practical aspect of doing decolonial work. Museums, by nature, they represent a very good space to engage in a praxis way with decolonization, especially ethnographic museums, because we all know the history of the colonial violence that you're speaking about. These things were looted, they were stolen during colonization, right? So how do we do the decolonial work in a museum? I'm sure we all think that decolonization is synonymous to restitution. That's wrong. There's so much that needs to be done to decolonize museum collection right now. Right? At Manchester Museum, for example, we have collections that are still carrying derogatory terms about Africans. Derogatory, unspeakable terms, categorizing Africans as Kafirs and all these other words. So if you want to do a decolonial practice without repatriating or restituting, why can't you start off by correcting those terminologies, right? Those improperly labeled. That's decolonization in praxis. So yes, we can repatriate and restitute, but I think provenance research, to me, has to be a kind of shared, should I say shared authority? Let's democratize our expertise as curators. Let's give up our powers as curators. Let's let local communities, both indigenous communities, whether they are diaspora community members in Manchester, with an interest in this material culture, come to our collections. Museums have to be very accountable for what they hold. Let's disclose what we hold, right? Then let's allow these diaspora members who are in Manchester, whether they are from Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Tanzania, let's show them what we have in our holdings. And let's have stories generated from that. That's part of provenance research, actually. Before we think of returning, which has become a very interesting decolonial methodology. So the provenance has to be very comprehensive. Another thing that I want to say, which we're doing at Manchester Museum, maybe doing differently, we're doing what we call unconditional repatriations or restitutions. So instead of waiting for claims to come to Manchester Museum, I'm a curator of anthropology. I know the history of this collection. I know these things were looted violently. We're going out to the communities by ourselves, right? Showing them what we hold and what we have. Without being prescriptive, allowing them to reflect on whether they want these things to come back to them and how they want these things to come back to them. So by doing that, we are decolonizing, democratizing our knowledge production and allowing communities to have an active voice, right, in the processes of restitution, repatriation, and provenance research.
I want to point out two things. The narrative of colonial history is that Africans or colonized people, they don't have a history and they don't have also culture. And I'm asking myself, which kind of culture is going to be showed now in museum if they don't have culture, if they are primitive, if they are a historic society, which kind of culture the museum are going now to show, and it comes just up while.
Thank you both. To close this sequence of questions, I'd like to ask you a final bunch of questions. It's not only a question for both of you. Also, Fogha, maybe you want to add finally something. To gather some final thoughts before moving to your questions. So it's going to be challenging. Are you aware of synonyms or similar notions and practices to Western terminologies? Of these terminologies, cosmopolitanism, positionality, and shared heritage in native languages of Togo or West Africa and South Africa and Zimbabwe? And since these terms drive the discussion surrounding restitution, is their use or the centralization of these terms reinforcing an exclusion of the communities from the larger debate? Do these terms need to be introduced into native languages, and if so, by whom? And will the introduction of these terms into native languages be a way of decolonizing the debate or on restitution? Or will their introduction be just an additional Western imposition? So this is a bit who...
I'm really struggling to... Is this a question about indigenous terminologies to replace shared heritage, personality, and cosmopolitism? I think this idea of a museum, to start off with, I think it's Western, right? But before the museum became what we know as the museum, these local people had their own ways of keeping their heritage, right? Keeping their material culture, and not only keeping, but keeping is a function of use, right? In Africa, we just don't keep things because we want them to look beautiful in a glass case. We use them and we conserve as we use, right? So I think, for me, terminologies, yes, they are there which were used, which are still being used to refer to heritage. South Africa has a very interesting concept of what we call the Ubuntu. Ubuntu, it's a good term. Ubuntu means a person is a person not because they are themselves, but they are a person because they belong to a community, right? A group of people. Just like heritage. Heritage is not something that is owned by one individual. It's a community, heritage of the people, right? So that acknowledgement of Ubuntu, right? That people within communities have the right to their heritage, to their culture, and it's passed on from one generation to the other through a process, what we call in Zimbabwe, we call it naka, like it's bestowed from one generation to the other. That's why we've got all these cultural practices that we're talking about right now, which didn't die because objects were taken away and were stolen. If you go to Africa right now, objects that we have at Manchester Museum, they're still being made, right? Why? Because when they were stolen, the cultural practice still continued, right? The ethnographic moments, should I say, the contemporary ethnographies right now, people are still making similar objects that you see in museums. So I think the question about terminology just goes beyond just the museum itself as a space of keeping, appropriating. Local people used to have their own ways and means of museumizing. In Australia, they call them keeping places in Australia. Keeping. In Africa, we used to have our own ways of also of preserving, protecting, and using things like restrictions, taboos, and the do's, the don'ts. Those were ways of preserving and protecting heritage, traditional management systems of heritage conservation, which are still being used up to today in the absence of a museum as a building, right? I'll end there.
You are better than me. I'm not quite sure if I have an answer to that, but I think it is a challenge to become, and we need to continue to reflect how we will go through that. Because a little bit complex. We need to study the languages. We need to study the ontologies to know how they can open themselves and how to make them open and accessible to other cultures or to new ways. But what I think personally is what I called the human rights. It is not Western conception of things. It is also a very centered in African cultures, the human right. We need to find them out there and to erase them as a flag and to adapt it to the European knowledge. What we are doing now in Germany, I said it, and I said it everywhere I'm going. It is what we call now provenance research in Germany is very Eurocentric. Very Eurocentric. They are saying, do that. There is no dialogue. Do it like that. Provenance research, where is that? What is it? What does it mean? What does it mean? What are we going to do with it? I am interested in research. I don't know. And the normativity we are using, the value, the rules, the principle, they are very Eurocentric. There is no dialogue. And sometimes I said we are already in a new colonial practice. We need to come a little bit back to accept, to suffer of critics coming from the South, and to to engage with those critics also, because me, I will never stop criticizing where I am not happy. I will say it. I can be arbeitslos.
In the interest of performance, I'll stand up. I am not human. I am not saying this as irony. I am stating a fact. I am a black man. That is what I am. To be human would mean I am white, that I introduce myself without need for categorization. I am not human. Now, that said, I do not believe in decolonizing the museum. One, I don't think it can be done. If we say we are decolonizing it, I would ask who colonized it. Number two, I do not think it's worth my effort. The second thing is, if I have accepted that I am not human, what comes next? Do I try to belong to the society of the human? Do I try to translate my existence into humanity, bleach my skin, my hair maybe, learn a British accent? Is that white enough for you? I'm not human. I will not become human. I do not want to become human. So why shall I translate the way I conceive the world? If we agree on translation, let us agree. To what language do we translate? What is the movement of the language, the movement of meaning, usually from my language into English? In German, the word for translation is übersetzen. So once you move something and translate it into German, you have given it a higher sitting, a higher standing. So if I would translate a Lamsot word to German, I would sit Lamsot on a pedestal. Literally, this is what these words mean. I do not want to become human. And the question for me isn't if we translate. The question is, can we exist without having to translate? Can we have cultures that do not have to justify their belonging to the English language? It's a rediscovery. That when we say, what do you call, it's a whole idea of again creating the world, or the world can only exist as far as the white man knows it. And I'm sorry, my cap does not have a meaning. It has no other meaning. And this is the thing where I think decolonizing museums misses sometimes, that everything is given a meaning. I can just have a stick because I picked it up from the street. Black people do senseless things. African people do senseless things. And South people, where I come from, do things without meaning. And the thing is, can I exist and do things with no meaning too? Why do you wear an earring without meaning, and when I wear mine, it must have cultural significance? Someone came up to me at a conference and said, does your cap have meaning? It has the meaning you want to see. So there's a Lamsot saying, ta mila yen mila. If you're looking for trouble, you will find trouble. If you go finding meaning, if you go looking for meaning, you'll find it. And again, my question is, aren't we again creating these categories that we want to see? When we say provenance research, especially in art, is about tracing ownership. Well, if you say who owned Ngonsot, a cultural artifact, and you're looking for ownership, which must be owned by one, a human. And so a person is not a human. Colonization has said that already, it's clear. The owner must be owned within a capitalist system that can be exchanged for value, usually monetary value. And then you have to seek how that ownership changed hands. Well, that is provenance research. Can we move from a place where I do not own anything And in fact, I own none of these ideas that I lay claim to. I owe them to people. So maybe we should actually start thinking, instead of provenance research, we should think of the research of depth. Who do we owe what we now call objects to? To what ideas do we owe the materialization of these objects to? And this, for me, is the cosmopolitan spirit. Not that every language is translatable to English, because it is not. The English language does not have the vocabulary for those languages. There's something in what we call nko. There's no direct word for it in English. Shall I invent a word for it in English in order to exist? And when those things are not translatable, they don't exist. My question and my point again with cosmopolitanism is, can we exist without needing translation? And it's not about belonging to the human society. Can we go beyond those, where even without translation, even without being seen and acknowledged by the white man, we can exist? And yeah, if we had places where we kept things. So, and this is a little, I'd like to respectfully disagree that keeping doesn't necessarily equate to a museum. Where my grandmother kept her dishes, it's not a museum, because she doesn't invite people in to come and see for a fee. And this is, again, where I think there's an extension of the territory of the museum beyond just the physical structure. And I'm thinking, beyond the decolonization of epistemology, can we decolonize ontologies, ways of living, when we say involving indigenous? Who is the indigenous person? Must we have an indigenous person? Indigenous to whom? Indigenous in relation to whom? Because the white person is the center, the universal, and so the indigenous must be qualified and categorized in that way. I cannot put this into words. And so I am angry now. But I hope this opens up a conversation. Are you angry or not? But that we really have this stimulation, and that we agree that in the end, decolonizing the museum might mean that the museum doesn't exist. So I would say, for me, the museum of the future is in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your responses, your previous interventions, and now we are open the discussion to the public.